Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for the invite to come. I'm an agronomist that gets involved in intensive agriculture as well as organic agriculture. I like organic agriculture because one of the things we notice is that we can see a good, healthy soil in terms of growing crops. The problem with intensive agriculture is that we can't, because we always hide the system with nitrogen. It's very difficult to come to terms sometimes with telling someone that they've got a very poor system who's getting adequate yields with high levels of inputs. And so the systems make things very complicated in terms of understanding how things work. What I was hoping to do today is we've got to do a little bit of talking about some of the analysis that we use. But what I wanted to spend a little bit of time on is talking about fertility itself, because a healthy fertile soil will help nutrition become available. And a poorer soil becomes, the less efficient nutrients are at becoming available. So one of the difficulties we have in agriculture is that the methods and tools that we have are incredibly diverse today, and quite often you get people arguing about the most minute details of what we have in terms of mechanical or inputs of fertilizers. And these systems actually sort of muddy the waters, really, and I feel in many instances if we understand how soil works and how it functions, all of these decisions start to become a little bit clearer. So if we just look at the bottom where you've got the difference between min-tillage, direct drilling and ploughing, if you take a really healthy fertile soil with good crumb structure, good nutrition, you're going to find actually that the soil in its peak of condition needs very little to actually work it in terms of tillage. So direct drilling becomes an option. Tillage is really all about doing as much as necessary, as little as possible. And each time you till a soil, you destroy structure, you upset the environment to a degree. Thing is, although direct drilling might be the ultimate in terms of managing a healthy soil, you couldn't possibly use a direct drill system in a poor soil because the soils are too tight, they're heavy, they're anaerobic, and so we have to intervene in terms of managing poor, difficult situations in terms of what the soil can't provide. So what the soil can't do, that's what tillage is all about. And for me, really, tillage is about thoughtful movement of the soil. And so really, we really need to have a reason to do something. If we look at what a fertile soil is, the argument or the discussions about what soil fertility is, it's really the natural production capacity of a soil without intervention, which really actually doesn't tell us very much. But quite simply, I believe it's all about microbes cycling organic materials. You put carbon into the system, microbes digest, recycle, rebuild towards humus, and in the process of that, you are releasing compounds and nutrients which actually help feed the crop. And the success of that is moved in towards what the crop can actually perform. Now, that really doesn't explain how you get fertility, but then we look at the position really where you have components of fertility. So you have the whole, if you like, which is fertility working in its utter efficiency. And around that, we then have the bits which are air and water. Plants are a component of fertility because a large proportion of the sugars that plants manage to collect from sunlight will be exuded out of the root system. So it's an immediate carbon source for microbes to utilise. We need manures, long-term carbon for the digestion throughout the winter in terms of breaking down carbon structures into usable products. Nitrogen, phosphate, potash, they're all elements of fertility which will help move the dynamics of a soil into one which produces production. Leads us on really to biological agriculture, organic farming, intensive chemical agriculture. The difference really being is organic farming really is all based around carbon. Carbon drives the system. As carbon is recycled and digested, nitrogen and nutrients are released for crop production. But in theory, we should be able to become a net importer of carbon under the systems that we do in organic systems. The problem with intensive chemical agriculture is that it's actually not run with carbon, it's actually driven by nitrogen. And the problem with intensive chemical systems is that as we put more nitrogen into the soil, you will find that it increases the metabolism of microbes. Microbes need carbon to be able to balance nitrogen, and then they respire off CO2. So, in effect, what we do is we're burning off carbon by using high nitrogen systems. And from my point of view, when we talk about sustainability, that is just not sustainable. As the soil gets worse and worse, you'll find that the aeration drops, the soils become heavier, more condensed, rooting systems are poorer, exudate production is less, and the conversion of nutrition into the plant becomes poorer. The whole system becomes inefficient. And so the nub of all this, as time goes on and as soils get poorer and poorer, is that we need to rely more and more on soluble products and purchased products to maintain yields from a system which is failing in terms of soil. Biological farming is something which is moving into the industry. We're having people who are really unhappy about intensive farming systems, who are finding that actually their average yields are coming down, their average inputs are going up, and they see that this is the one way they can't afford the system for the future. And so now we're getting quite a number of people which are joining together to look towards utilising the benefits of organic systems, managing soils in a way which builds fertility, while actually trying to utilise less and less of the chemical infrastructure to create a good soil. So there's a halfway house here. The thing is, I think the future of the system has got to be based around farmers themselves. A lot of the things we're talking about don't involve products, they involve information and knowledge. And quite often with our industry at the moment, if there's not a product to sell, it's very difficult to move things forward. So I believe the future of organic farming or all biological farming is in the farmer's understanding of how a soil works, how to manage fertility, how to move things forward. In other words, you build the system from the soil upwards. I did want to mention sustainable intensification because to me it sits really badly on my shoulders. The two words really don't fit very well together. But my point on this really is that if we have a poor system, what is the point of sustaining it? We really need to think about a completely new paradigm which is going to drive soils, build carbon and create a future structure for farming. The earlier speakers this morning were talking about how many soils we are losing in terms of compared with soils that we've been creating. We just cannot manage to keep something which is getting poorer and poorer. We have to find a new system in a new way. We haven't really got time to look at all the other bits and pieces, but it's just a sort of an overview that I think really with fertility, farming is all about managing fertility. Without a healthy soil, we can't grow anything. It's always been that way, and it should always be that way. The problem we've had over the last 50, 60 years really is that we've been able to bypass it, quite successfully. But we found as soil health declines and things get more difficult, then we have to go back to the basics, which is basically managing a soil in terms of what we used to do. What I wanted to do was to try, I don't know how clear this is really, is to just run through a few of the soil tests and tissue tests that we do, try and discuss a little bit about some of the problems in organic farming. We have problems in intensive agriculture as well, but I thought maybe it might be a good thing to talk about some of the issues that I see when I go around farms. And this is an ordinary index test, and I don't know if you can read this, but basically we have very poor levels of phosphorus, potassium, and magnesium. And in fact, I think they're index naught. And I come across this quite a lot. And the problem really is that some people perhaps 15, 20 years ago considered that organic farming was self-sustaining, and it isn't. If you take something off enough, eventually you're going to have to replace it. And one of the big issues is that people haven't had really a set of money put aside on an annual basis to manage fertility. And eventually what happens is the nutrition starts to drop. The difficulty with the system we have at the moment is that you're only really asked to put fertilizers on when you have a low level in the soil. I can't see any reason why we can't maintain good levels. The problem, if we drop levels down to very poor conditions, to get from a naught of phosphate up to an index of 3, we could be talking of about 500 to 600 kilos of phosphate, actual phosphate. Well, we can't afford that. And so in many cases, when we go into farms, we're having to look at the whole system. And because we can't afford these large inputs of fertilizer, we're having to look at sort of very almost homeopathic amounts and targeting these fertilizers to the areas which are most efficient in terms of use. We can't put phosphate right on its own because we've got actually 3 limiters here. In fact, actually there's more limiters than those 3, but we've only measured 3. So when you think about it, if you manage to sort your phosphate levels out and bring those levels up to a 2+, we've still got the limiters then underneath of magnesium, potassium coming in. So to really manage a poor system, we've actually got to manage all these issues at once. And that makes things even more difficult if your funding is limited. So in many instances, what we're going to have to do is to try and target perhaps phosphate to the legumes, because in many cases we're finding actually legumes require decent amounts of phosphate and calcium. If you haven't got enough, they start to die out. So that the first thing, and then try and target the spring crops with something like patent kali, which is a kieserite sulfate of potash product, but it's going to have to be on an annual basis because we can't afford the investment to bring these levels back up. There are quite a number of farms who get to this stage and say, I'm finished because I haven't got the funding with the organic system as it is to be able to bring these levels back up to something which we would regard as being normal. We have a lot of farms actually considering coming out, trying to find more organic methods, if you like, in terms of their manures to build this system up, and they may maybe think of coming back in. One of the issues that we have on a soil like this is that we really can't grow legumes. The problem being is that phosphate is required every day of the plant's life. Legumes require phosphate for energy. If we don't have enough energy in the system, we don't get very good growth. We can see here on these legumes, we've actually got physical signs of potassium and magnesium deficiency. Well, we need magnesium for chlorophyll production, so we're not producing very good sugars in this system. We need potassium to move sugars around. And when sugars get very low in a plant, when we do Brix readings in these plants, we find actually that weevils are attracted to legumes, and the weevil's offspring live off the rhizobium. So if you think the basis of organic farming is putting a legume in to grow nitrogen and energy in the system to drive the system forward, if we don't have these elements of fertility, then this system can't function adequately. This is some lucerne here. We've got very dire deficiencies of potassium and magnesium here. So the difficulty basically is that low phosphate, low potassium, low magnesium, weevil, poor rhizobium, no nitrogen, poor root exudates. Organic systems quite often are low in energy and nitrogen because when we get to these low levels of nutrition, we haven't got enough to drive the system forward. And quite often we can find organic matters building, but it's not organic matter as such as important, it's the organic matter that cycles that's important. So as you cycle and you digest and rebuild, you release nutrients and organisms to compounds for growth. And the eventual success of all this is really down to humus production. So I just wanted to show you a different soil type here and a different problem. Here we have an index which actually is all in the normal range. Phosphate, potash and magnesium is all perfect. The problem we have is that the pH is very high. And quite often we find actually that if you have a pH much above 6.7, it means you have an excess of a cation, which is calcium, magnesium, potassium. If you have a low pH much less than 6.2, you have a deficiency of a cation, which is calcium, magnesium, potassium. In the case of this particular one, we've got very high calcium levels in the soil. And with poor biology and poor organic matter, we find actually that calcium can tie up every mineral in the soil. So although we've actually got good elements within this index system here, the availability is very poor. And quite often, one system alone is never enough to actually to come to terms with what's going on within your soil. We find that all the nutritional systems we have are relatively inaccurate. But if we do lots of different ones, we look at the trends as to where things go. We do all these sort of audits and reports we do are available through lots of other people actually, but what we tend to do is to try and actually make something a little bit more complex. So, So this is an audit that we do. We have an index system on the top here. We have cation exchange through this area here. Cation exchange really is the positively charged elements which are exchangeable from the clay and humus colloid. We then have a couple of major anions here, phosphate and sulfur, tissue analysis, the trace element analysis. We try and measure organic matter, the release of nitrogen from organic matter. And down here we have something called a Reams test, which gives us an idea really of what's available in the soil in terms of immediate solubility. And quite often we find actually there's some contradictions between the two of these. But you can see here that we've got very poor levels of phosphate on these top two indexes. There's two different fields. As we move down, we can see the pH quite high. We've got an excess of calcium on the exchange sites, and that excess of calcium is having an influence on the availability of magnesium and potassium. So even though we've got relatively good magnesium and potassium in this soil from the index system, the excess calcium is actually upsetting the availability. The interesting part is when we come down to this solubility test down the bottom here, you can see that we have an absolute dominance in calcium. We're looking for around about 1,100, and in some cases we've got 34,000 kilos. And we're looking at this complete domination of calcium of the soil upsetting the availability of potassium and magnesium. The interesting difference between these two fields is this one here actually is one of the best fields on the farm. But what we see down in this bottom here is the phosphate availability is actually very good, even though we've got next to nothing in the soil. Quite often we find that when you have diverse crops, you find that each crop will be exuding different compounds, if you like, out from the soil system. Legumes are renowned for being slightly more acidic. So in some cases you can create an environment around the rhizosphere where phosphate can become a little bit more available. But we tend to look at this as being what the biology can make available or what is in solution for plants to take up. And quite often, even though we've got these other deficiencies up here, it's looking for trends within the system to see what's actually being missing. This is another one, which is an interesting one in the sense that we've got a very poor index up on the top here, and these three are fine. It's interesting that this farm actually is a direct drilled farm, and quite often we see in direct drilled situations very high iron levels. What tends to happen is that as air is excluded out of a soil, you find that iron tends to reduce, so in effect you're actually giving yourself more iron sitting in that soil profile. And it can be a good indication that we've got some type of compaction. The interesting thing down the bottom here on this Reams test that we've done is every single figure is low in calcium, we're low in magnesium, we're low in potassium, and we're very low in phosphate. So as soils become tighter and there's less oxygen available in the system, aerobic biology starts to dry up, and quite often it's the exchange of nutrients, the accessing of nutrients, bringing back to the plant rhizosphere that tends to be upset. Plants themselves don't produce lots of enzymes. They tend to produce the sugar exudates. They attract microbes to the plant root system, and it's in return these microbes will produce enzymes to access soluble fertilizers in the immediate area. So there is a biological link and a connection with the plant and the soil, and the two work together. Now, what I wanted to show you here really is that there are some contradictions in this audit here. We've got these indexes are pretty good. This Reams test down here tells us we have a problem with availability. And 3 months before we did this test, we did a tissue analysis. And this confirms tissue analysis really is basically a plant telling us what it's actually got in its system. And here we've got very poor deficiencies in all the areas: calcium, potassium, phosphate and magnesium. These systems are all really based around trying to monitor and manage to find where our biggest weaknesses are. And once we've got this information, then we hope that we can put something together in terms of putting a programme. The input. 2 minutes. This is just another example. We've got a very poor soil here. You can see we've got no crumb structure in this topsoil at all. In fact, you could really call this soil basically an infertile soil. We've got these phosphate indexes up here. Nearly 4, 3, 5.1 for magnesium. If you do a tissue analysis, we found we're chronically deficient in phosphorus, potassium and magnesium. So the link between the plant and the soil and what's accessing in the soil is biology. And managing biology and creating a system makes a lot of these nutrients more available. Sometimes results don't give the answers. In these particular cases, it's a leaf test that we've done. Everything is pretty poor. But when we get to this sort of stage, you have to go back to what's important. And what really is important, the starting point really for all plants, is phosphate and calcium. And once we start that, if we can get the system moving and developing, we'll do some more tissue tests to find out then exactly what's going on. But you find that, unfortunately, you get the whole system works as a whole, but there are leader groups which actually help the plant grow. Nitrogen, quite often, if you have too much nitrogen in the system, you create growth. You then have to have more of the other elements to balance the extra nitrogen and growth, and so you're making your deficiencies worse. With organic systems, we tend to find that actually nitrogen and energy are part of some of the things we're missing. So we're talking about what can we do about all this. Well, the thing is that we have to manage energy and nitrogen somehow. We're lacking in terms of products that we can purchase, and what I believe that we all should be doing really, we should be looking at planting cover crops in one way or another. There are so many benefits to managing cover crops and putting them in a green form into the soil to act as short-term carbon, lots of available nutrition to feed the next crop coming on. And all the things that we get here, we've got suppressing, I won't read through them, but we've aggregate structure there. They are such an important part of feeding the soil biology. I just wanted to show you how much is a good cover crop worth. As a friend of mine did some work, and he put a legume in. We had 6,000 kilos a hectare of organic matter. He measured the top growth. We found that 1.5% to 2% was potassium, which would be a contribution of around 90 to 120 kilos per hectare, 30 kilos of phosphate, 100 kilos of calcium, 100 kilos of magnesium. And the thing about this is that if you want to grow a 10-ton a hectare crop, you've got to find yourself somewhere in the region of 250 kilos of available nitrogen. You know, there are people across the world that would do 3 or 4 of these in a year to build up enough energy to get that sort of system driving. So you're collecting energy from sunlight, you're collecting nitrogen from the atmosphere, you're sapping up all the nutrition within the soil system. When that goes back in, it's available quickly for the next crop. The problem with this, unfortunately, is that if we take this scenario and go back to our first index test where we had 0, 0, 0, we've got the system which is upset already because we can't collect the sunlight, we can't collect nitrogen because the plant isn't working. So although these things are a fantastic idea and they're a great system, we've got to look at the basic fundamentals of what farming is all about. In other words, it is the elements of fertility and looking at which are the biggest limiters in the system so that we can manage in its entirety. So, we use an awful lot of biological products which have fantastic responses, but I would say to anybody that the product isn't the answer, the system is the answer, the product may be part of the system. And what we have to try and do is find out where our biggest limiters lie, and then create a plan which includes these sort of things to move things forward. I just wanted to finish on we are now doing tests on the balance of fungi to bacteria in soils. There are new tests coming on looking at specific groups of organisms within soils. They're really helpful because every plant species will have a slightly different link to biology in the soil. So if we're growing a mob grazing type style grass system with 22 species in, they will all have a different relationship with microbes in the soil. They'll all be producing different exudates, different compounds to attract different biology into the system. So the more we can feed that entity, the more biodiversity and resilience we can create into the system. And so nearly all the arable crops I've come across, I've done about 200 of these, every single one comes back to fungal deficient. And it's simply because fungi can't cope with high soil movement. Mycorrhiza can't cope with high soil movement. So, perhaps sometimes it's looking at our system and understanding what we're doing as to where our limitations may lay. And really, we want fungi in the soil. They're really important. They're the lignin digesters, humus builders. They release vitamin B. They're all sorts of things. When you think the whole system can only work as a whole, if you take one part of it out, then the whole starts to collapse. And these are really serious figures, really. We're now starting to look at new tests coming in, which will measure specific types of organisms within the soil. And that, again, will move us into perhaps another area of management. But the more we know, the easier it is to manage. And from these systems, really, I would say that none of them are accurate, but putting them all together, they can give us a really good idea of where we should be moving organic agriculture to. That's me. Thank you.